Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our 2025 Doc Talk series. We're going to be talking about diets for autoimmunity today. I'm Dr. Molly Force, and I'm joined by Dr. Rosalie de Lambert, who's here. We are the Prosper Natural Health Care team. We are naturopathic physicians who really love our experience and that we get to weave in natural modalities in our treatment plans when we're coming up with primary care treatment plans for our patients. And so we get to go beyond just the standard pharmaceuticals. And one of the things that we like to do is share with our community and our patients some of the most relevant topics that are coming up for us in clinic. And this is a way just to help everyone stay well educated and for us as physicians to get to review some of the newest literature that's coming out about some of the concerns that patients are bringing up. So today we're going to be focusing on autoimmunity. We want to make sure we cover for you guys what autoimmunity is, how it works in the body. It's very complex. So we're going to be going over some of the science behind that and why it's really, really important to think outside the box of just looking at pharmaceutical options for treatment. So we're going to be talking specifically about diet and how modifying the foods that we're taking in can really impact the immune system. And we're going to talk about some of the research that's come out for these different diet recommendations for specific autoimmune diseases. So we're really excited about sharing this information with you today. Autoimmunity is a big deal. It's actually affecting 1 in 15 people in the US, and they're saying it's closer to 1 in 12 for women. So we see this more in women than in men. Now, what it is really the body attacking itself, and particularly it means that the body has produced these antibodies against its own tissues. So this can happen with many different tissues in the body and they can be organ specific. So maybe only the pancreas, for example, is attacked, or it could be something where there's autoimmunity where we see the DNA itself get attacked or pieces of the cell membranes get attacked, where multiple systems in the body, multiple organs can be affected. So we can confirm autoimmunity through blood work, through these diagnostic markers that we see where we're checking for antibody levels. We're seeing if the body has created this immune response where it's now being told to attack these tissues that are actually self tissues, where the immune system has gotten confused about that. We also often will track autoimmunity with inflammatory markers, which can be seen in blood work. And sometimes there can be very disease specific antibodies that we're looking for. So specific organ systems or tissues that we're looking for with these antibodies being produced. Now, there's a specific type of antibody called an ANA or an anti-nuclear antibody, and that's one that's often tested for a many different autoimmune diseases that we see that tissue marker come up, that antibody come up. And that's a big deal because that means it's actually impacting the cells themselves that are being tagged and really damaged by the immune system. We also can find autoimmune conditions and track them for some autoimmune diseases through different imaging. And that could be something like an endoscopy where they're looking down at the tubing of our upper GI tract, or a colonoscopy where we're going up through the colon. Once we know that autoimmunity has been confirmed, this is a really serious thing because we know that we can't totally turn off this cellular signaling that has now happened. Once the body has tagged these tissues, these antibodies are going to be continuing to be circulating often. And we know that autoimmunity, because of this, is considered non-curable. That being said, we know that we can often really manage autoimmunity and even in some cases make it subclinical. So patients aren't having active tissue damage and they're no longer symptomatic. Now, this is not always a guaranteed option, but what's so beautiful, we feel like with the naturopathic perspective, adding this more functional model where we're looking at the physiology of how things works, other than just using pharmaceuticals alone, is that we can layer that on to treatment where patients might be using pharmaceuticals and add a whole breadth of different options for them, like dietary changes, like changing different lifestyle factors that might be causing, triggering more inflammation or more immune dysregulation.
So here's a list of autoimmune conditions that we see in our practice here at Prosper. And maybe you've heard of these, maybe you have one of these, maybe some of these are brand new for you. Most of these conditions have what's known as a positive ANA. Sometimes they don't, but that positive anti-nuclear antibody that Dr. Molly mentioned is kind of the like umbrella first marker that shows up in autoimmunity. Basically, anti-nucleus, which is the center of the cell, immunity, anti-self, right? So we see a good amount of type 1 diabetes. That's an autoimmunity to the pancreas. Hashimoto's thyroiditis, autoimmunity to the thyroid. Rheumatoid arthritis, type of autoimmunity to the joints. SLE or lupus is multi-organ, which means not just the kidneys are affected, but the skin and the whole body system is affected in lupus. Celiac disease, that is one seen in the GI tract. IBD is a variety of diseases, including Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, where the primary symptom is usually bloody diarrhea with these. Psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis affects autoimmunity of the skin and the joints. Multiple sclerosis, autoimmunity of the nerves. Graves' disease, another type of autoimmunity to the thyroid. Vitiligo and rosacea, both autoimmunity of the skin. There's way more different diagnoses of autoimmunity, but I wanted to offer kind of the top 10 of the ones we see in our practice here. So let's get pretty sciencey on the immunology of autoimmunity. It's just how does it come to be that certain bodies develop markers against themselves? So we've got to think about this in 3 phases. The first phase is the initiation phase. A variety of triggers, whether it's environmental, genetic predisposition, are put together and lead to a breakdown of the immune system, what's known as immune tolerance. This is an important term because it has to do with how well your body notices what is a disease, what is an infection, what is cancer, what is autoimmunity. So there's a breakdown of this kind of funnel system in the immune system. Once that happens, we get the early stages of autoimmunity and the immune cells start to be recruited, the ones that say, oh, we've seen something strange in the thyroid, we're going to attack the thyroid. Next phase here, step 2, is the amplification phase, where your autoreactive immune cells thus create more of an immune response, and all of a sudden we get the inflammatory cascade, okay? All sorts of immune inflammation cells are recruited, causing, for example, in Hashimoto's, a swelling of the local tissue, right? When we think of inflammation, we think of swelling and heat. Chronic inflammation is what's the problem with autoimmunity, is this inflammation never goes down unless we have some sort of specific treatment. The resolution phase is what we are trying to get to in terms of helping and in terms of our treatment plan. This is where all of a sudden we have a diminishing of the autoimmune reaction. A whole bunch of things we'll talk about, including diets here, will help diminish that autoimmune reaction. The immune system is rebalanced. Those little markers are still there, and there's still relapses and remissions in the symptoms, but the whole inflammation cascade is much diminished. So here's just a handy visual, if you're a visual person. It's, definitely sciencey, pulled straight out of the primary literature, but it's a way of describing what I might have mentioned in words. Is on this left-hand side, the initiation phase, the propagation phase gets really expanded, and you see all the cell lines in the immune system, whole bunch of immune cells that just really proliferate, making inflammation. And then that's the big expression of symptoms for folks. It's just all of a sudden, wow, like I feel different than before. I'm not, my body's not responding to my prior treatments. And then lastly, that resolution phase.
So here's what we see in our patients. First, we see this silent change that happens where the immune system is triggered, and all of a sudden antibodies will show up on blood work. But most people aren't getting blood work to check antibodies at this point. People don't have symptoms during this silent phase. The next thing that happens is reactivity. This is where people might start to notice like, something's not going right. I'm starting to have symptoms about this inflammation and about this immune response. So the antibodies stay high during this time, and all of a sudden symptoms start to show up. And this might be where some patients are going into the clinic to figure out what's going on. Oh, I have a new rash. Oh, I'm all of a sudden my blood sugar's out of control, that kind of thing. But there's not necessarily a whole bunch of tissue damage at that point. The disease phase where we actually see true autoimmune disease is where all three of these things happen. We have these tissues that have been tagged, these antibodies that are high, we have symptoms, and now we actually see destruction. So for example, with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, this is where not only do we have the high antibodies and we have symptoms of it, but we actually have damage, which is permanent damage to those thyroid tissues. Now, our goals, the reason we share this with you is our goals as physicians is to help people stay out of that disease state. And if we can, step them out even of the reactivity state. So I ask you to think about this. If you are an autoimmune patient or know someone who is, think about where they are in these three stages. We want to get back into that silent zone, but we also want to put this out there for people who don't know if they have autoimmunity or, are just starting to have symptoms. This is a critical time period because we don't want you to get into that area of tissue destruction. We think about this especially for like rheumatoid arthritis, where there's permanent damage done to those joints every time we get into this autoimmune disease state. And that destruction can be, once again, lifelong and very concerning. So we really want to be thinking about this, and this is a great tool for us in understanding where somebody is with their autoimmunity and what our treatment goals are going to be looking like. So there are a lot of different risk factors with autoimmunity, and we care about this, especially as naturopathic doctors, because this is what helps us turn up or down that knob, that control, panel for this inflammatory immune response. So we know that there are genetics that are at play. That's a hard one to control, but it's just something we need to put out there. But there's a lot of epigenetics, and that means other things that don't have to do with your genes necessarily, but can trigger certain gene scenarios, okay? Or certain outcomes with your proteins. So we know that low vitamin D, it's established well in the medical literature. So that makes us immediately think, hey, what can we do dietarily or sunlight-wise or supplementarily with our vitamin D? Can we be measuring those vitamin D levels and keeping those in a controlled area to reduce our risk of autoimmunity or help us get out of that autoimmune state and back into more of a silent, subclinical, we'd call it, state, okay? We also know that there's definitely dietary components, and we're going to be showing you this cool literature that's come out here in a second. When we think about certain autoimmune types, especially celiac disease, we're going to talk about some others here as well. We know that gluten is a huge trigger. Obviously, with celiac, that's the #1 trigger for autoimmune tissue destruction. So we have to remove that from the diet. There's just no way around that. We also know that certain minerals can be at play here. High iodine, for example, we're going to see that one we know correlates with higher tissue damage for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is a very common autoimmune condition. We also know that there are certain bacterial and viral and even fungal infections and parasitic infections that can push autoimmunity. It can really trigger it. So it's really important. If you might be having a secondary ongoing infection, that could really trigger an autoimmune flare or even initiate the autoimmunity. Hormonal balances, we know that hormones are at play here. So that's a big deal, especially when we think about puberty, we think about perimenopause and menopause. That really can affect autoimmunity and how the immune system is responding. Same thing with pregnancy. Now, it's not just women, but women do seem to be more susceptible to autoimmunity, and this is one of the reasons. So we got to think about what's going on with a hormone balance, and that's something that we love to work with our patients. Very critical. We also know that there can be damaging things like sunlight that's coming in. UV radiation can absolutely trigger and can affect the intensity and can, to some degree, with some things like psoriasis, be helpful. So it's an interesting thing with autoimmunity, right? Now, as far as pharmaceuticals, we know that there are some pharmaceuticals that have been linked to triggering autoimmunity, especially SLE or lupus, which is the one where we have this really high ANA and we have actually multi-tissue organ damage. Microbial disruption. We know now that the microbiome is critical to keep stabilized, and because about 70% of our immune system is modulated directly by the immune system of the gut in particular, if we're disrupting that microbiome, we're going to have a much higher risk of autoimmunity and autoimmune flares. We also know that there are toxins that can be involved. Now, this doesn't just have to be things like chemical pesticides, but that is very much included here, and we see that in the medical literature. It could also be things that you're exposed to in your work environment. So that could be like different paints, different dyes, even nail polish, solvents, those kind of things, heavy metals. We know that recreational toxins, of course, smoking and alcohol have all been associated with triggering autoimmunity. And we know that there is the daily choice of what we're surrounding ourselves with. So that might be the things that we use for our hair products, shampoo, hair dyes, cosmetics, and we know that silicone implants may have an effect on the immune system as well. So all of these things help us remember that we have choices in what we're doing day to day that might impact our immune system. And it's important to start there because we want to step people out of that disease state, out of that tissue damage state, and back towards that silent state. We want to invite you guys to use the resources that we already have available through our clinic. These are free and they're posted online for you to check out at any time. So watch them at your leisure. If there's any of those recordings that might help you understand better some of your triggers and might help you understand balancing those specific organ areas, please look into those and watch those. They're there for you. Just check us out at prospernaturalhealth.com and then click on our Doc Talks tab and or our education tab, and it'll take you to the Doc Talks. And so that education tab is right at the top. So those recordings, for example, if you have issues with joints because of your autoimmunity, check out our joint health talk. There's one all about vitamin D. There's one all about the thyroid. So check it out. There's a lot on there, including a whole bunch of digestive talks.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So if you've got questions about, okay, do I have autoimmunity, or am I in those early stages, or what's the status of my current autoimmunity? There are some lab works, there is lab work that gets conventionally done, also that we do here, that can get you started in kind of understanding where you're at. So the first one I start with any questions of autoimmunity is what's known as that ANA cascade. So we're kind of circling back to this really important marker. Anti-nuclear antibodies, which means, again, you're attacking the nucleus of the cells. Anti means an attack, a self-attack to the nucleus of the cells. So this is a three-part test, right? The first is a screening. Do we see any ANAs present, which is that immune response, right? Positive or negative. In the case of these labs here to the right, we've got a positive ANA, which means, okay, we cascade, the labs cascade to the next step, which is that ANA titer. Basically, how positive of a positive do you have? Do you have a clinically relevant positive, or do you have a teeny tiny positive that we can't doesn't get diagnosed, but we know is already just the first stages of autoimmunity. So in the case of this patient here, 1/320 is a high, a very clinically significant positive. Basically, they have to dilute the blood 320 times over in order to see they continue seeing those autoimmune cells present, which is kind of a really significant positive here. If that is present, then the cascade continues down to the pattern of what these autoimmune cells look like under a microscope. So a whole bunch of different patterns, whether it's speckled or in the case of this patient, nuclear homogeneous, which kind of leads us to, okay, which of the possible autoimmunities might you have based on this pattern under the microscope? That would be the next step with either a rheumatologist or your primary care physician, naturopathic physician like us, is just, okay, if we've got a positive ANA cascade, we definitely need to look into what is the true diagnosis. And that's where we look at disease-specific markers. Are there lupus markers? Are there Hashimoto's markers, right? So that's kind of the workup in the lab work that kind of confirms or negates the diagnosis. So this next step is kind of the meat of our talk here, is where we talk through what are the diets for all these specific autoimmune conditions, and what does the primary literature say about how can we modify what we eat in our lifestyle in order to modify the disease state.
This first study is pretty new, came out in 2023, and it's looking not just at what goes on for celiac patients when they have gluten exposure. This is looking more specifically at our Hashimoto's thyroiditis population. Now, these are people who have autoantibodies against their own thyroid tissues. And what they're seeing here is that there is a connection with gluten exposure in the diet, which means including things like our wheat grains and bread, noodles, all those kind of pasta, beer, those kind of foods. And we see this also with it actually impacting the inflammatory response. So we know how very, very important now it is to actually pull gluten back from the patient's diet who has Hashimoto's. And this is one of the first places we're often starting as naturopathic physicians. And we can even see this, in the medical literature, looking at it potentially affecting the permeability of the gut intestinal lining, which is a big deal, and it affecting the microbiota. So that goes back to our probiotics that we were talking about.
So this research study has to do with autoimmunity called multiple sclerosis. So the body attacks the nerve tissues, and then you get a whole variety of levels of nervous dysfunction. So difficulty with movement, difficulty with thinking is sort of like the first stages of it. So this is one of the most profound, in my opinion, dietary modifications to this disease, but also more expanded to all autoimmunity, is just this modified Paleolithic diet, which when we think about the paleo diet, I think the like media and the fad literature, media has really made this to sound more like a meat-heavy diet. It's a modified Paleolithic diet in that it's a veggie-heavy diet. Of course, you're getting some proteins from the meat world, but this specific dietary approach has patients take 9 cups of fruits and veggies a day as a incredibly disease-modifying treatment for MS specifically. This is, yeah, like I mentioned, really powerful change. So if you do any Googling on the Walls protocol for multiple sclerosis, you get a whole lot more information about this. But what's significant about this study here from 2022 is that this modified Paleolithic diet has been associated with a reduction of MS-related symptoms, reduced fatigue, improved mood, quality of life within a time frame that's significant. We're talking weeks of the change.
Here we get into omega-3s, and what we see from this huge systematic review, they took 70 human studies specific to patients that had diagnosed rheumatoid arthritis. And they looked at what the impact of high dose omega-3s were. So we're talking about omega fatty acids, which are usually derived from marine sources like fish oil, for example, or krill oil. Now we have an entire talk on fish oil, so check it out. This looks at how it actually helps not only the symptoms be reduced for their RA, but it actually helps their pharmaceuticals work better. So their pharmacotherapy. So that's really a huge boon, huge helpful piece for us. Now, we also see in this study discussion about vitamin D supplementation and how critical that can be in addition to sodium restrictions. So think about all the sodium that's in a lot of our processed foods and our foods that we get from restaurants. And that can really affect joints and joint swelling and the immune response. So we want to be thinking about that with our patients. Now, this study goes on to say that there are good outcomes from vegetarian modifications, certain eliminations of certain proteins, and certain elemental diets. So these responses depended on the person, so they weren't as broad sweeping, but at minimum, starting with looking at, are you on a good omega-3s? Are you getting enough sources of marine proteins from your diet for our RA patients? And then what's going on with vitamin D levels? Those need to be checked yearly. And are we getting enough either through our foods, which is a little harder to do? They're looking at usually cod liver oil or some kind of liver to do that, or are we getting it from sun or supplementation?
So here's another research article from 2023, specifically in terms of rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And this was novel for me in sort of looking through this primary literature, is that actually a low salt diet modifies the development and progression of both of these autoimmune conditions, rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And so one of the recommendations, if you have this combination or one of these autoimmunities, is to actually modify your salt intake. And the specific study describes kind of how that works immunologically. You know, it affects the macrophages, it affects your specific immune cells. A high salt diet is actually pro-inflammatory. So this is a pretty simple modification, especially if you are suffering from either of these autoimmune conditions.
And we go on to see more literature coming out about lupus or SLE, looking at what's happening with high protein diets versus low protein diets. And in this study, they were saying that because there's so much kidney damage that happens for these lupus patients, reducing the total quantity of proteins in the diet source can make a big difference for how long their kidneys can function before they go into organ failure. And this is once again, a hugely helpful tool for us to promote longer health for these patients that are facing a really challenging autoimmune condition. So in this, they're not just saying, reduce the amount of proteins. When we think about that, that might be a lot of, high amounts of meat consumption. But they're also saying if we can be thinking about reducing the total amount of calories, focusing on high fiber foods that are high in these good fatty acids, that are high in phenols, which are one of our antioxidants that we see in the colorful foods. These are really also helpful for the macro and micronutrients, and probably, once again, that microbiome that can be impacting in SLE or lupus.
So here's an article from 2023 on a Mediterranean diet as a modifying factor for psoriatic arthritis. Remember, the Mediterranean diet is a diet that's high in omega-3s and has a much different lipid panel or fat contribution than the standard American diet. So, this is a pretty interesting review that talks not just about the Mediterranean diet, but also sleep and exercise for this particular autoimmune condition. But also quick, simple fix, dietary change that has significant changes for psoriatic arthritis.
Next, we get into some of the autoimmunity of the GI tract. And for example, this is about ulcerative colitis. Now, our GI tract autoimmunity tends to have some of the most bang for its buck in regards to modifying diet from what we clinically see. Although all of these are going to be deeply impacted by diet, because the tissues are along that GI tube, when they're being exposed to some of these triggering elements through food, they can be very problematic as far as really increasing autoimmune reactivity. So in this study, they were saying patients who went into this exclusion diet, so what they meant by that is they were reducing certain types of disaccharides, so certain types of carbohydrates. They were reducing saturated fats. Those are the fats that remain stable and solid at room temperature. So we think like butter and meat fats usually. If we're reducing things that are emulsifiers, so those are different chemical agents that allow emulsification, and then ultra processed and the red meats, then we see maintained remission after 6 months. So that's a big deal in 100% of this, of this studied arm of this study, which is amazing. So that's pretty darn significant, and it's definitely something that we see in our ulcerative colitis patients for sure, that if we can modify that diet and get them in this anti-inflammatory states, they can often stay in a longer term remission. So that's moving them towards that silent phase, remember.
Here's an excellent study, meta-analysis of the randomized controlled trials. So we love to see these kinds of studies, like the best of the best, the cream of the crop type of primary literature that has to do with probiotics and the microbiome as modifying factors for autoimmunity in general. So the results of this meta-analysis showed that your microbiome specifically targeted therapies improve the symptoms and inflammatory factors of a whole slew of autoimmune disease: celiac, lupus nephritis, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, psoriasis, and multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. So this is super exciting. I think, like Dr. Molly said, 70% of the immune system is in the gut. So if you have an immune dysregulated disorder, we absolutely need to be looking at what's going on with the microbiome. We have stool tests, comprehensive stool tests that is where I start with patients who come into my office.
Here we see another really kick butt meta-analysis study that's looking specifically at turmeric. Now, many of you have heard of turmeric or used turmeric. Using it clinically can be a little bit different. These extracts can be pretty darn potent. We always want to think about what's going on with our patients when we're dosing out turmeric, but it can be a very safe intervention for many people that is very strong in regards to how it modulates the immune system and how it regulates inflammation. This was a really cool one because it was saying that in this big meta-analysis, they saw the ulcerative colitis, they saw that oral lichen planus, they saw that rheumatoid arthritis all showed significant improvements, and that there was some improvements also in the Crohn's patients, the MS patients, the lupus patients, and psoriasis patients. And some of them also showed that there was improvements for some of our other arteritis patients as well. So there's a big group of folks that have autoimmunity, and we see curcumin, that extract from turmeric, being a modulating factor for the immune system. So pretty cool to think about that. So including that in our diet, or even supplementing with it if that's appropriate, is another option.
So we have a physician grade apothecary on site here at Prosper, also available online through our full script or specific nutraceutical companies. And so what that means is that the products have been vouched for and third-party tested for quality, and are, essentially labeled, and you know exactly what's in there, you know how potent they are. This is an increasing problem in the supplement world, especially with these like big third-party warehouses, is just actual like supplement quality. So all that said, in terms of describing kind of supplements that could be helpful in autoimmunity, we have a physician grade apothecary here. So some of the ones here available in office are a whole slew of turmeric products that have been emulsified and kind of combined in a way that makes them most absorbable. So you're getting the maximum benefit from the turmeric, and specifically the curcumin constituent, the anti-inflammatory constituent that's extracted from it. A whole variety of vitamin Ds from capsule to liquid form, and then a whole variety of fish oils as well that have a different mix of omegas in there, of the EPAs versus the DHAs. We did a whole doc talk about fish oils. So if you're interested in this, remember to check out our education tab. And then lastly, we have some like food specific ingredients like these algae greens or spirulina or chlorella product that is ultimately like your super greens that would correspond to the Walls protocol, that like 9 cups of fruit and veggie diet that we talked about earlier for MS, is another quote supplement, but it's a food supplement that I end up utilizing a lot for my patients that I'm trying to replete their nutritional status for, to support their mitochondria. Of course, probiotics, a whole slew of them that I cater to the individual. It has to do, I don't just recommend a blanket probiotic. I always talk to patients about their GI symptoms before I make a very specific recommendation of which kind of probiotics to give patients. It's definitely not a one size fits all recommendation here.
So one of the beautiful things here is we get to choose many different topics to share with you guys. And next month, we want to be talking about neurotransmitters, and we're going to talk about serotonin, which is considered our happy hormone. It's great for the kind of the deep part of winter to check in about. This is one that can really impact people in regards to things like depression and anxiety. So it's a really important topic, and we hope that you can join us. We're going to release it on the 13th, so that's second Thursday of the month, and it'll be online for you to watch at your leisure. We love sharing this information with you guys, and sure do hope that if you have any questions or want to get a little bit deeper on what's going on for you or your loved one, or if you are wanting to really create a tailored treatment plan, that is what we do. So we would love to work with you. Give us a call or check us out at prospernaturalhealth.com. You can request an appointment that way. And we hope that you enjoyed our talk today and got some good information from it. Take care.